Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Severn Sound Environmental Association Noxious Plants ID training. My name is Patrick Jackson. I'm the Invasive Species Program Coordinator, and I've been working with various plants for about a decade and trying to avoid noxious plants, mostly successfully, for a bit longer than that. So today we're going to review some of the tips and tricks on how to ID them and ideally how to avoid them. Okay, so what is a noxious plant? Any plant species that can cause potential harm to property, crops, or livestock and humans are considered noxious. Um, Today we're going to be focusing on the noxious plants, which primarily cause humans issues, but certainly the other plants are important as well. All of these plants that are considered noxious are regulated under the Weed Control Act, and there's lots of great information within that act on best management practices, herbicide use, that sort of thing. So if any of you are very keen on trying to eliminate them, I would definitely recommend checking out those regulations. Another key component of this training will be invasive versus native. As I said, I coordinate our invasive species program, so I primarily focus on invasive species, but certainly I have a good understanding of both, and we work with both at SSEA. So what is an invasive species? It's an introduced species to an area, so it's something that's not supposed to be there. And it typically is fast growing, displaces native species, and can permanently alter ecosystems. They can also have significant economic impacts and cultural impacts. So there's species that we really don't want in our watershed. Versus native plants, they're the ones that are beneficial. A lot of things rely on them, and they're meant to be here. Another thing that will be discussed quite a bit in this presentation are toxic plants. Um, so toxic, there's a lot of words out there: toxic, poisonous, venomous. So toxic refers to anything that can cause harm, essentially. So if you ingest it, or you come into contact with it, or you breathe it in, those are considered poisonous, aka toxic. So that's primarily what we're going to be focusing on. Venomous is usually something that's injected, so that's the type of thing that we talk about with snakes, spiders, but certainly there are other things that are venomous. But for today's talk, we're not going to be really referring to venomous things. It's primarily going to be poisonous or toxic plants. So yeah, again, from contact, so poison ivy, parsnips, if you brush against them, you can get a contact dermatitis or a rash. And then there's certainly lots of other species that if you eat them, you will get very sick and you could potentially die from. Um, yeah, just essentially don't eat any plants while you're at work or even outside of work. I would stay away from it unless you really know what you're doing. One of the key takeaways, really the main key takeaway for me is when in doubt, leave it alone. So if you don't know the plant that you're interacting with, don't touch it. The best thing you can do is take some pictures of it, stay far away, and you can send those through to Severn Sound Environmental Association, or send them to a supervisor or a coworker who might have a bit firmer grasp on plant ID. But yeah, the best thing you can do is avoid them. It's really tricky, plant ID, because plant appearance can vary quite a bit depending on season, habitat, growth stage. There's a whole bunch of variables. Poison ivy, for example, typically has 3 leaves, but potentially one of the leaves is fallen off from weather or time of year. So it can really vary. And then another thing that's really important when you're trying to break down a plant ID, you want to get multiple ID features and not just rely on a single ID feature. So looking at the leaves, are they serrated? Are they opposite, alternate? What does the flower look like? I mean, plants flower at all different times of year, so that can be a great ID feature sometimes, but not great at others. What type of stem does it have? Is it herbaceous? So like, is it a similar material to the leaf, or is it woody, like bark? There's a lot of different ID features to look at, and it's important to have a firm grasp on a couple of those to work towards a positive ID. Plant identification. Okay, so we're going to review some of the native noxious plant species, and then we'll review some of the invasive ones as well. So poison ivy. This is probably the most common noxious plant that workers in Ontario will interact with. It's often mistaken as an invasive, but it is native to the province. We actually have two species of poison ivy within our watershed. We have the eastern and the western poison ivy. The western is by far the most common. It's typically a low ground cover, so it can get as high as waist height. I've seen it in certain areas, but it's typically a low shrub along the ground. It loves roadsides, the edges of parkland, trails. So it's one that's going to be very common in areas that might be mowed or line trimming, that sort of thing. So it's really important to try and avoid poison ivy as best we can. As I said, we have two species. So the eastern, which is a lot less common. It's more common further south in Ontario. It is more of a vine, and it can vine up trees and go quite high. So it's important to recognize that both do exist in our area, and that we need to be cautious. Poison ivy is a high risk because it causes a contact dermatitis. It's a rash, and it's not an immediate reaction. So typically for most people, it takes several hours before you start getting itchy. It can take even longer than that. And it's caused by an oil found within all parts of the plant called urushiol. So that's another component that's really important with poison ivy. A lot of people think it's just the leaves, and it's really not just the leaves. You can get it from the stem, you can get it from the berries, you can get it from the roots. Personally, I've had poison ivy a number of times. It's a plant that doesn't like me, and I don't really like it. And my worst case of poison ivy was gardening in the spring before any leaves were out from any of our plants, and getting into the roots. And you just don't really think about it until you've got a rash all over your hands. So that's another key component when you're doing any sort of work with roots, or you're doing lawn mowing or line trimming. It's really important, even if you don't think that you've interacted with it, to wash your hands really well, get that oil off your hands, and get that oil off your clothing. So wash your clothing, wash your boots as best you can, and it will really help reduce the chances of getting a bad case of poison ivy. Some of the key ID features with poison ivy, leaves of three. So there's a common saying, leaves of three, let it be. So you'll see the three leaves, and that's true of western and eastern poison ivy. The three leaves are a little bit different. So the two on the side are close to the stem, whereas the one in the middle hangs off the stem a bit further. So that's an important ID feature. They also come off of a woody stem. So there's other plants out there that have three leaves, but they're typically herbaceous plants. But yeah, when in doubt, leaves of three, let it be. Okay, so we've got a couple of different poison ivy growth forms here. That we've got up in the top corner here, we've got some roots and a dormant eastern poison ivy. On the top left, we've got some western poison ivy on the ground, and it looks like some eastern poison ivy potentially vining up. On the bottom left, we've got poison ivy in the fall. That looks like the western poison ivy. So as you can see, the leaves can have a bit of a sheen from that urushiol in their leaves. And this would be spring, fall, winter. This is the kind of thing in the bottom right that you would see at this time of year. You'd see the green berries. They can be green to white. You may not see the leaves. So this is probably the highest risk period, because it's a little bit tougher to recognize unless you've seen a lot of poison ivy in your days. Stinging nettle. So this is another one that can cause contact dermatitis. It's not as severe typically as poison ivy, but a lot of these plants that we're discussing have some variability. So some people are more sensitive to particular plants than others. So that's just something to keep in mind. Stinging nettle grows quite tall. I've seen it 6 to 8 feet tall. It has heavily serrated leaves, as you can see down here, which kind of alternate up the stem. They're opposite, but then they alternate kind of like a ladder as you're going up. They also have these flowers that droop off the stem, and the stems have little pointy needle-like hairs, and that's typically the part that injects the poison. And so that's the part you want to avoid. Typically, if you brush stinging nettle, unlike poison ivy, where you probably won't know for several hours, stinging nettle you will probably know within 5 minutes. It's pretty quick. It hurts quite a bit, and then it goes away quite quickly. Typically, as I said, there's variability, so depends on the individual. And in terms of habitat, it's mainly in disturbed areas. I see it a lot on trail edges and open fields. So here's a couple examples of stinging nettle. As you can see, it can get quite tall. You've got a good example of the leaves on the top left, the heavy serration. You can see there's a pair of leaves opposite to each other, and those kind of alternate as you're going up the stem. You've got a great example of the stem in the bottom left. You can see those little needle-like protrusions that can that cause the contact dermatitis, and it's quite itchy. It's kind of like a cross between poison ivy and a bee sting in my experience. And for me personally, I find it lasts about 20 minutes. So it is nice to get that relief, but it does hurt in the short term. And as I said, it can get 6 to 8 feet tall. So getting that stuff in your face is not pleasant. So something to keep in mind with PPE if you're working around this stuff, potentially a face shield if you think you might be brushing against it. Okay, poison sumac. So this one will be very rare. It's not to be mistaken for staghorn sumac, which is extremely common. Staghorn sumac is the one that has fuzzy stem, and it turns bright red in the fall. It's got those reddish furry berries. Um, Poison sumac is specifically in swamps. So there are a few spots in our watershed that have poison sumac. One of the ones is Y Marsh. In certain areas, poison sumac is present. It's a close relative of poison ivy. And as a close relative, it has the same active chemical. So it's urushiol, the same oil, and it's found in all parts of the plant. So it has that kind of like shiny leaf look. The stem can be quite reddish, and it's a bit taller than poison ivy. It typically grows as more of a shrub, a tall shrub, than poison ivy does. I've seen it growing 6 to 12 feet tall. But again, it's going to be in swamps. It's going to be in really wet areas. So it's not as much of a concern for municipal staff that are going to be working in parks and trails, but something to keep an eye out for sure. So here's a few examples of poison sumac. The leaves look kind of similar to a sumac, but no serration, quite smooth and shiny. The bark can be reddish to brown. Typically, it's more reddish along the outer edges of the stem. And similar to poison ivy, it often has like a greenish berry that droops down a bit. Okay, so now we're into that kind of summarizes some of the noxious native plants that we have. There are some more, but those are the worst and probably the ones that you have the highest likelihood of seeing. The next section we'll cover are the invasive noxious species. Okay, so this might be the most dangerous one on our list, giant hogweed. So it is a very large plant. It grows 12 feet tall easily. And it has a very immense flower. So when this thing is flowering, typically in June, but flowering can vary, it its flower head can be 2-3 feet across. So a very, very substantial flower. That's where it gets its name. It's tall. It's got a really showy flower. It was introduced to gardens. I guess there's some crazy gardeners out there that really like giant flowers. But this plant is really dangerous because it's phototoxic. So that means if you get the sap on your skin and that sap interacts with the sunlight, it can cause a chemical reaction, which can give you second-degree chemical burns. So it's quite nasty. If you get those chemical burns, you will have to go seek medical attention, and it will take a long time to heal and potentially leave permanent scarring. Um, some of the ID features, I've already mentioned a couple. It's got that great big white flower head, bigger than any look-alike. It'll typically have a purplish blotched stem, which we'll see in a minute, and it's got heavily serrated leaves. So when I say serration, those are like zigzags in the leaf. And again, we'll see those in a minute, a little bit closer up. But I always find it looks like kind of like a rhubarb leaf that you gave to a kid and they like cut it out with scissors. Um, habitat, it's going to be along roadsides and trails. It does like kind of wet areas, but it's certainly adaptable and can survive in a few different habitats. One of the hot spots for it in our watershed is along the Utah Trail in Severn. So with that in mind, there could potentially be spread along that entire Trans-Canada Trail system. So something to keep an eye out for. There's a lot of lookalikes of giant hogweed, which we'll go over in a little bit. And it's in the carrot family, so a lot of the other carrots also can have phototoxic properties to a varying degree, and some people have more sensitivity to them than others. Okay, so here's a few examples of giant hogweed. As I said, so the top left corner, you can see some folks who are managing it. They're pretty well in hazmat suits. So if you were going to manage this, I wouldn't advise ever pulling it, just because of the high risk. Typically, the safest way to do it is a herbicide application, a foliar application, so right on the leaf before it goes to flower, because they produce thousands and thousands of seeds. So you want to avoid that. But you can see these deep, deep cuts in the leaves. That's very indicative of giant hogweed. You can see how tall it is, and you can see the flower head starting to form. It's fairly early, so they're probably in there managing it at the moment. You can see the stems are hollow. I wouldn't advise ever getting to that point with identification, because that means you've probably cut it and you've exposed some sap. So yeah, it has a hollow stem, but don't go seeking that out as an ID feature. You can see that giant flower head right here, big white flower head, as I said, 2-3 feet across. Some of the lookalikes, there's a native lookalike called cow parsnip, and that one has a smaller flower head, but it's very similar. It can get to about 8-9 feet tall, so a little bit shorter than giant hogweed, but it is also phototoxic. It's a very close relative. It can give you chemical burns, but it is a native species, so it's not one that we actively encourage people to remove. But if it is in a high priority area like a trail or a park, certainly it would be under consideration to make that area safer. And then at the bottom corner, sorry, you can see that purpley blotched texture on the stem. Okay, and then we've got another relative in the carrot family, wild parsnip. So again, this one is phototoxic, just like its cousin, giant hogweed. This one is easier to separate out because it has a yellow flower. It's much smaller than giant hogweed. I've seen it around 6 feet tall. But the leaves are similar to parsley. So if you're familiar with parsley, I'll show you the leaves in a second here. It's typically in like a lot of the other ones, it's in disturbed areas and fields. And yeah, as I said, it's phototoxic, usually to a lesser degree than giant hogweed, but it's still variable, depends on the individual. So if you see this plant, I would encourage you to avoid it unless you have the proper PPE and training. Okay, so as I said, the leaves are kind of like parsley. You can see the leaves in the top left corner. They're quite lobed and are opposite of one another, coming off the stem. The stem is somewhat ridged, as you can see, and there's no blotching. You can see so as I said, it's in the carrot family. So when you pull the root out, you can see it looks like a big carrot. Um, I wouldn't advise getting to that point without PPE or proper training. And then there's a yellow umbel flower. So the umbel is kind of like an umbrella. Um, yeah, and that's quite indicative, but the flower heads are typically 6 to 12 inches across. They're not nearly the size of giant hogweed. So giant hogweed versus parsnip. As I said, the umbel flower in giant hogweed, it can be up to 1 meter across. I typically see it 2 to 3 feet across, so about half that size, but certainly it can get quite large. Whereas the umbel on wild parsnip is usually around 20 centimeters. The leaves are quite large, so think about like a large rhubarb plant, how big those leaves are. They'd be comparable to a giant hogweed, but giant hogweed are heavily serrated. The leaves on wild parsnip are significantly smaller, like 30 centimeters, and they look like parsley. The stem's going to have purplish blotching on giant hogweed, whereas it's going to be green on wild parsnip and be quite ridged. In terms of height, giant hogweed can get quite tall. I typically see it like in the 3 meter range, 3 to 4, but certainly it can get even taller than that under the right conditions. Whereas wild parsnip, it's typically a bit taller than the average person or about the height of the average person. Um, and it has that carrot root when you pull it up. Okay, so here's a few giant hogweed lookalikes. I didn't include cow parsnip, but it looks very, very similar, and we're often called about giant hogweed, and it turns out to be cow parsnip. So wild carrot, it has a white umbel flower. It's going to be in ditches all over the place, but another name for it is Queen Anne's lace. It typically doesn't get bigger than like a saucer. So if you're having tea or coffee like that, just a little tiny plate. So yeah, they don't get very large, and but they can give phototoxic reactions occasionally if people are particularly sensitive. Spotted water hemlock and bulblet-bearing water hemlock are typically found in wetlands. They're not typically known to be phototoxic. However, they are extremely toxic if ingested. So yeah, again, they have that white flower. You might hear residents calling about them. As long as you're not ingesting them, it's usually not a huge concern. But if there's an area where there's going to be young children, those would be species that you would consider managing. And water parsnip, again, is one that looks similar to the previous two, and it occurs in wet areas. Okay, and our final invasive noxious plant is yellow iris, which surprises a lot of people. It is aquatic, so I mean, you can get it in gardens, but it's typically going to be in wetlands. That's where it likes to invade. One of the key ID features, obviously, is that it has a yellow flower, thus the name yellow iris. Unlike its cousin, the blue flag iris, and it's going to have really thick, long, flat leaves. Um, as I said, it likes shorelines and wetlands. The sap is what you want to watch out for with yellow iris because it can give you contact dermatitis if you get that sap on you. So you want, if possible, if you're pulling it out, you just don't want to get any sap, and you want to wear personal protective equipment. So as I mentioned, you've got that three-pronged flower that is yellow. You've got the broad leaves coming out from a single base, and then the root system. Yeah, the irises are going to be difficult to ID by the roots, but there's a photo for you. So Some of the health effects, they vary depending on the species. We've already discussed this a little bit, but the reaction onset can be very different depending on the species. Stinging nettle is almost immediate for most people. So if you walk through it, you're going to know you walked through it. Poison ivy, it's going to be quite delayed. So you could walk through it, you could go home, the next morning you wake up with a rash. So that's where hand washing comes into effect. If you wash yourself really well, you wash your equipment, oftentimes you can help prevent a really bad poison ivy reaction. Duration, so stinging nettle, as I said, is usually very short-lived. For most people, it's 5 to 20 minutes, I would say. Whereas giant hogweed, you could have lifelong scarring. So, yeah, something to consider, especially when you're planning your work. And then the different toxins they produce. So a lot of these plants are producing urushiol, which would cause contact dermatitis, versus like giant hogweed and some of the carrots, which are phototoxins. And when they interact with the sunlight, they cause a chemical reaction which burns your skin. With the phototoxins, one of the key things, if you've been through a patch of giant hogweed or cow parsnip or wild parsnip, you want to cover up your skin immediately to limit that reaction with the sunlight, and that can help prevent significant burns and then get to an area where you can clean off appropriately and potentially seek medical attention. If you think that you've seen an invasive or a native plant that you're not sure about, by all means, please reach out to us. My contact information is there. And yeah, if you're ever not sure, we've got lots of professional staff that can ID plants. Michelle is Huddlin, who should be here, is great. Travis, our tree expert, is also great at plant ID. Another great resource is iNaturalist. So that's a great app where you can just take a picture, you can upload it, and it's citizen science driven. So often there's a lot of professionals on there that can help you get to an ID on a different organism. So that's a great one to have on your phone when you're out in the field. And it's one we actually have an invasive species spotter project for. So it's kind of crowdsourcing our invasive species monitoring a little bit. And then if you are sure that you've seen an invasive species, or even if you're not 100% sure and you think you've got an invasive, you can always call the invading species hotline, which I believe is monitored by OFAH. It's a great resource, and like for something like giant hogweed, they could send a crew out to take a look. But again, it would be best to reach out to us first, and then we can escalate that if need be. Okay, so this is the fun part. We get to do a little quiz, and I'll leave a little bit of time for everybody to guess as to which species is present. Okay, so the first species is in a ditch. This one's a bit of a trick question, a curveball to start out, because there are multiple species present in this photo. Um, a couple of lookalikes, not all of them are noxious. Okay, so the species that are present, there is some poison ivy in here. So that is kind of around the post and probably the dominant plant in this photo. And then there's also some creeper. So it looks like Virginia creeper, which is not a noxious plant, but is one that's often mistaken for poison ivy. So you can see that one does not have 3 leaves. That's kind of the center photo there. Okay, next one. So just for a little bit of context, this is on the side of a trail. It's a very large leaf and it's heavily serrated. So this one is giant hogweed. This is before it flowers, so this would be the time of year when you'd want to apply some herbicide to it to prevent that seed bank from establishing. But as with pretty well all of these plants, you still don't want to interact with it at this time of year. If you rub up against it and you get that phototoxic sap on your skin, you will not be having a good day. Okay. Um, so this plant, this is kind of a dormant stage for this plant. You've got some berries, but you can see there's not really a lot of greenery behind it, so it's probably late fall, early spring, or potentially sometime in the winter. Okay, so this is Western poison ivy. So yeah, as we discussed, you've got the greenish white berries, and all of the parts of the poison ivy are capable of giving you a rash. So just keep that in mind if you're brushing up against the stems or the berries or even the roots at this time of year. Okay, so I think this one was on the side of a wall. So it tends to vine, and I'll leave it at that. Okay, so this one is one of the Virginia creepers we were talking about earlier, and it is not noxious. It's not a hazard to human health, although it is one that's often mistaken for poison ivy. Remember, with poison ivy, leaves of three, let it be. This one has 5 leaves, so that's the one of the first giveaways you'd look at. But certainly with this one, it has similar serration or notches in the leaf, and the leading leaf kind of droops down a little bit more. It has a similar droopy look to poison ivy and a little bit of a leaf sheen. But yeah, it's relying on that key ID feature. Look for 3 leaves. Okay, so we've got a 3-leaf plant. And this one you would probably see at this time of year in the woods. Okay, so this one, it might be hard to see from the picture, but you've got 3 leaves. You've got this growth protruding here, so that is going to be a flower of some sort. And then we've got a stem right here. So when you look at that stem, it's a little bit tough to tell, but there's no bark on the stem. So it's herbaceous. It's similar to the leaf material. So we can pretty well rule out poison ivy. But if you're not sure, don't touch it. This one right here is a white trillium. So also not noxious. Okay, another 3-leaved plant. And again, this is going to be a little tricky because we only have one angle. This plant is similar to the last one. You're probably going to find it in the woods, in woodlands. Okay, so this one, you'll notice it doesn't have any leaf serration, and all of the leaves connect tightly to the stem right here at this central point. Poison ivy, you would expect this leaf to hang off, have a little stem and hang off a little further. You'd also expect to see potentially a little bit more serration in the leaf. And when you look at the stem, you can see it's herbaceous. It doesn't have any bark. It's more similar to the leaf. So this plant is Jack in the pulpit. So not noxious. Okay, and another three-leafed plant. I was kind of mean and I threw a bunch of three-leafed plants in here just to show you that there's a lot of them. But when in doubt, leaves of three, leave them be. And just when in doubt in general with plants, if you don't know what it is, don't touch it. Okay, so this one is Western poison ivy. So it's fairly tight to the ground. It's a little tricky to see because it does look a bit herbaceous coming off this main stem, but as you look down, it's got a woodier bark. It's got these leaf serrations, and it's coming off of the main stem. The main leaf is coming off a little bit further than the others, and they're drooping a little bit. Um, as I said, poison ivy can be a tricky one because it is highly variable. Sometimes you will see those serrations or notching on the leaf, and sometimes they will be fairly smooth. You'll also notice that some of the leaves have quite a sheen, which can be a reasonably good ID feature for poison ivy as well. Okay, certainly a tall plant. As you can see, I think that gentleman is about 5 to 6 feet tall. So that kind of gives you a point of reference. And I think this was on the edge of a trail. Okay, so if you guessed giant hogweed, you are correct. This one is giant hogweed. You can see how big the umbel flowers are at the top here. Certainly a lot taller than this man. And you can see the really heavily serrated leaves. So those are both great ID features. And you can also actually see in this picture that there is purplish spotting on the stem as well. Okay, so this is a tricky one because it's zoomed in a bit. So you're not really getting as many ID features. It's a lot harder to do ID tests over just a single photo than it is seeing stuff out in the field. It's usually a lot easier. For point of reference, that insect is probably the size of someone's fingernail. Okay, so this one is Queen Anne's lace, also known as wild carrot. So not typically phototoxic, but some people can have a bit of a reaction to it. That's the white flower that you see dominantly on the roadsides. It's not native, but it's not typically considered a highly invasive plant. Okay, we've got another umbel or like umbrella flowered plant. This one's bright yellow, and it's I think this one's along the side of a ditch. Okay, if you said wild parsnip, you are correct. So remember, this one has the yellow umbel, which is one of the features that really helps set it apart. You're also going to look for those parsley-like leaves. And I think this is the final one. So great big leaves. This one you might see as a garden escape or around an old homestead. Okay, so this one was a bit of a trick question. Um, this is rhubarb, so not not toxic. You could eat it. You could put it in a pie if you want. But yeah, just big, large leaf. Don't it? Yeah, good frame of reference. Okay, so thank you everyone for attending this training. If you have any further questions, feel free to drop us a line, send us a phone or give us a phone call. And yeah, if you have any questions, um, there should be an SSEA staff that's able to answer any of the questions you have. Thanks and have a great day.